All right, I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone. This is the Kennedy School Conflict Management and Depolarization Seminar, presented in collaboration with the Center for Public Leadership and the Management, Leadership, and Decision Science area. My name is Julia Minson. I am your host. And today I'm really excited to be joined by Juliana Schroeder. Juliana is a professor at the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley. And Juliana has some incredibly timely and super interesting research on how different conversation modes impact conflict outcomes. So it's work that's both sort of really important at a societal level and very applicable to all of our conversations day in and day out. So I'm just thrilled to have Juliana here, and I will let her tell us more about it.
Thanks so much, Julia. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you, even though it's virtual. At least it's video chat, which you'll see is that has pretty good outcomes. So, and I shortened the talk title a little bit, so I'm just calling it Bridging Divides Through Conversation. If any of you have questions throughout the talk, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise a virtual hand and we'll get to it. I'm happy to make this very conversational. Okay, so let's start by setting the stage and talking about the level of ideological disagreement in America right now. And a lot of the data I'll show you focuses more on America, although of course there's disagreement happening across the world. And so I like these data from polarizedamerica.com. It looks at standardized disagreement in roll call voting in the House and the Senate over time. And the reason I like it is because it goes all the way back to 1879, so right past kind of the Civil War, and the kind of disagreement was sort of at an all-time high by this metric. And then you see disagreement declining in America, and then you start to see it rise again. And so this cuts off in 2015. I actually looked this morning to see if they've extended the data set, but they haven't yet. So you can only imagine what's happened in the last 6 years, but you can see that now disagreement, at least again on this metric, is at an all-time high, even higher than it was right past the Civil War. And so this kind of brings me to the idea of polarization, the conception of it. And I want to start off by noting right away that there are these many different types of polarization. I'm going to focus on 2, but they're also called different things across different literatures too. And so a lot of scientists, behavioral scientists across many fields are thinking about this question. And so it's not surprising that different terms are being used, but I think it's important for us to all get on the same page here. And so there's, ideological polarization, sometimes it's called issue polarization. That's just the state of disagreement. And then there's affective polarization. Sometimes it's called partyism or social polarization. These asterisks are referring to the fact that they're used differently across the different fields. And that affective polarization term really refers to the feelings of animosity between political opponents, the idea of othering each other, and something that has been implicated in the behavior of political intolerance, the unwillingness to let opponents express their views. And so I think many scholars have argued that ideological polarization can be a good thing. Like, we want a democracy in which there is disagreement. That's something we should be striving for. We wouldn't all want to have the same view. That would be awful, right? But it's really the affective polarization, the animosity that this is invoking, the demonizing of the other group, that seems potentially problematic. And so there are many people who are now saying that affective polarization is one of the biggest problems in America today. That's not a statement I'm ready to make, but others have been saying this. Here, I'm just going to put up a set of organizations. These come from the Listen First Project. But in earlier years, when I would present this work, I'd point to 1 or 2 organizations that are kind of doing some work in this space, and they're trying to address affective polarization. And now there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these organizations. This is not even the full set. This is just 2 pages worth of the organizations. And so, they're basically making statements like distrust and fear and contempt have poisoned our society and our relationships. And you can also look at statistics that 87% of nationally representative Americans in these surveys are saying that political polarization is a threat to America, and 52% feel scared for America. So let's kind of talk through what the kind of evidence looks like for affective polarization. And so here's some survey data that was collected in 2017, 2018 that I found pretty compelling because they were framing things in the questions in a pretty interesting way. And you see kind of these statistics that came out of this particular data set. 66% of people surveyed see the opposing party as a serious threat to the US. 42% see the opposing party as, quote, downright evil. 20% say many members of the other side lack traits to be considered fully human. So that's kind of direct evidence of dehumanization there. And then 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats say the country would be better off if large numbers of opposing partisans just died. All right, so you want to look at the data underlying these points, of course, but it paints a bleak picture. And here's another set of data that I thought was pretty interesting. And so this is the percent that reports that the quality applies to the opposing political party that put it as over 4 on a 1 to 7 point scale. So that's the way that this is calculated. And so you see some people endorsing more positive traits in the other party, saying that they're honest and reasonable and caring, but that's a minority. So fewer than 31% saying that, and many more people are endorsing these very negative traits that the other party is brainwashed and hateful and racist. All right. Just some statistics to kind of get us thinking about what's happening in America these days. And I have thought about the fact that a lot of these effects seem to be driven by a common psychological cause. And in fact, I really think that all of points of social friction kind of come down to the same root, which is that because people don't have good access into other people's minds, they have to engage. I mean, this is kind of the core of all social psychology. This is not a new idea. They have to engage in what we kind of call inferential guesswork, using these indirect cues to infer mind in others. And so the inferential guesswork involves things like stereotyping and just high level beliefs that you apply to other people. It also involves kind of more of a grassroots approach. So actually talking to someone and trying to read them and looking at their nonverbals and listening to what they have to say. And so then I'm updating and forming inferences about mind. And when I say mind here, because not everyone might be familiar with the way that I'm using that term, I'm referring to both the nature of another person's mind as well as the presence or perceived absence of their mind. And so when you think about the kind of key social consequences that derive from this lack of direct access that we have into other people's minds, there's 2 particular categories. One is that that can lead us to misread other people's mental states, others' preferences, their intentions, their opinions, and so on. And so thinking about how that plays out in terms of disagreement, you can imagine the way that people will very quickly infer bad intention from some ambiguous behavior. So if someone voted for Trump, we know, and there's been some nice research on this, that actually doesn't even mean that they necessarily support Trump. That vote could be because they were opposed to the other party. Maybe they're opposed to Clinton, right? And so that's why so it's sort of the lesser of 2 evils. And so, but that's not what people think of. Instead, they kind of make all these inferences, these bad inferences. So you kind of think about the conception of thinking of someone as being evil, right? So that might kind of come from that. And then the second kind of line of consequences that come from this is that not only do they misread other people's mental states, but we can overlook other people's mental capacities. So thinking of people as not really having a sophisticated mind at all. And so, here you're talking about, again, having some ambiguous behavior and then a person inferring that there was a lack of thought. So you can again think of the example of someone voting for Trump, and then here they maybe think, oh, not only are they evil, but they're also stupid, right? Okay, Julia, go ahead.
Thanks, Juliana. So this is incredibly interesting, and like what a provocative way to start a talk. Like, here is the root of all human problems.
All social problems.
All social problems. Okay, all social problems. But so what I'm thinking about is, like, how does this relate to like, why does ambiguity or lack of insight into others' minds lead us to make negative conclusions, right? Like, it almost makes me think about people like anthropomorphizing their dog, right? Like, I have no inference or I have no insight, so I just assume that they, my dog loves me and is smarter than they really are. Are there sort of certain conditions under which you're more likely to reach the overly negative conclusions under ambiguity?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So something that is interesting that comes up over and over again is that people's default tendency to engage in theory of mind is not very sophisticated. And so when you ask, and so you find this in survey data. So when you ask about, the average person or the typical person, or maybe it's even an individuated person in a class. So your classmate in your, Chicago Booth MBA class, people tend to rate them as sort of being lower on the survey than how they would think about, say, themselves. All right, and that's kind of just the sort of the default state. And some of the theorizing in that has been that, basically people lack the kind of cognitive capacity to be constantly sort of engaging in thoughtful consideration of others' minds, and just that lack of attention can lead them to have that kind of negative default. So the default seems to be, somewhat negative. But in addition to that, I would say that your point still stands, Julia, more broadly, that I was briefly muted. I'm sure that was a mistake. I'm unmuted now. I was just saying that there are moderating variables as well that, you could imagine there might be times when the lack of an action, people might infer a good intent, based on the context in which it occurs. And so I think context, is a moderator to think about. But I think in these cases where you have group identities, and so people are sort of easily set up to think about their group and the other group, that they're quicker to get to the kind of negative conclusion. It's a good question. Okay, Hannah, go ahead.
Hi, should I wait for my question? Are we breaking your flow, or is this an okay to ask?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, great.
There's no flow.
Yeah. So here's what came to my mind. I have a question for you, trying to connect this to some of the research on the psychology of partisanship. So I'm thinking like Lee Ross, Keltner, Robinson, Lowenstein, Babcock, right? And I'm imagining that even if I could have total access into somebody else's mind, I would still selectively process that information to reinforce my preconceived notions. And so the question is like, how do we distinguish those two? Like I don't know. Respond to that. Like, how do we think about that in relation to whether it's the lack of access or the processing mechanisms?
Yeah, so I think the lack of access is a primary point, but you're right that even if you had information right in front of you, or you could access somehow, I can magically read, Julia's mind. That doesn't necessarily mean that other biases wouldn't still come into play, and I might, engage in confirmatory thinking and, still misinterpret things, even if they're kind of right in front of me. And by the way, I don't mean to kind of put this out as like everything would be solved if we just had perfect, transparent access into other people's minds, because that would be a nightmare, right? Like we wouldn't have secrets from one another, and the whole idea of politeness would go awry. So, I'm not trying to make that provocative point either. Okay, let me continue on a little bit farther, but these are all great questions. Kind of keep them in your mind. Okay, so how can we go about, closing the gap that kind of exists between two minds? How can we get better access into another person's mind so we can even begin to go about the process of understanding their true beliefs, which I think is a prerequisite before you can even think about something like conflict resolution. And this is another dramatic statement, Julia. So the only means that we have to do this is through conversation. And so conversation is the way in which we can bridge this divide. There's really no other way to do it. And so kind of this gets to the broader question of, well, what do I mean by conversation? I'm using that term kind of broadly, and it's actually a lot of people just in the past several years, a lot of scholars have started thinking about, conversation more broadly in social psychology. And so Karen Huang, who's a PhD student at HBS, and Alison Wood Brooks is on this paper, refers to conversation as an interaction in which each person acts in coordination to contribute to an experience of shared understanding. Adam Mastroianni and his colleagues have called conversation the critical bread and butter of all of social engagement and social interaction. Thalia Wheatley and her colleague have referred to conversation as a platform where minds meet to exchange ideas and hone norms, or she also referred to it as a mental road trip that we collectively steer together, which I kind of love that imagery. And so going back to this idea of bridging the divide between minds, I think of it as an attempted exchange of mental content, attempted because it's not always successful, of course, of mental content, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, opinions between two or more people. All right, so again, when you look at this slide, you think I'm saying that conversation is the solution. Oh, and so, sorry, let me make kind of the broader point here before I get to that, which is that to the extent that understanding is a component of resolving conflict, and if you don't have true understanding, you can't hope to resolve conflict. I think many of these organizations are recognizing that conversation is this key ingredient, that it's a necessary component. Okay, but where I was getting to on that last slide is that it still has many problems, right? So it's not necessarily a solution. It's sort of something that's necessary, but there are challenges that come with it. All right, and so I'm going to outline some challenges and some problems with conversation on this slide. But first, I will pause and go ahead and ask Jen Lerner to share her question.
Hi, Juliana. Thanks so much for sharing your work with us, your wonderful work. I just couldn't resist pushing you on the only hope because I want to know, for your program of research, is it actually important that you plug this as the only hope? And are you intentionally taking a stand saying that, for example, there's lots of research Scott Wiltermuth and others have done on how when people do things in synchrony together, that without verbal contact, they actually come away feeling more bonded. And there's research sociologists, et cetera, do on people that have shared religious experiences together and musical experiences together. And there are many other lines of research on ways to develop a sense of oneness and to kind of get into bridging the problem of other minds. And philosophers have written about this. And
so I would argue that, and I'm going to cut you off if you have more examples.
Yeah, I just want to know, is it crucial to you that you say that there are unique properties from conversation that make it the only hope? Or is this a let's all rally around conversation, but it isn't our only hope?
Yeah, and so what I meant to do, and maybe I wasn't effective in doing this, is to define a conversation very broadly. Like it's a form of communication that involves the sharing of mind in some way. And so all of the examples that you gave, I would consider that. And so there could be narrower definitions of conversation that just involve, a verbal exchange, right? But there's also all sorts of nonverbal exchanges that we're acting in sync, or we're just making eye contact, or we're engaging in experience together. And so to me, those are actually forms of conversation, communication, connection that would fit under that same umbrella.
Got it. Thanks.
Yes. Very good clarification. Possibly I should be referring to this in a broader sense, but I'll think through that. Okay, so what are some of the problems that come up with this? And so one that has been considered a lot lately, I'll call it the coordination problem. And so that's the idea that by definition, conversation requires more than one person. I mean, I suppose you could have one with yourself, an internal conversation, but I'm thinking about it as involving another person. And that brings up many questions of how do you actually go about coordinating? And some of these questions are just, purely functional, like how do I go about starting a conversation with somebody who is different from me, perhaps, or someone I don't know that well. I've looked at conversations with strangers. Some more recent work has thought about the end. How do you coordinate an ending? When do you end? What are all the weird signals that people send when they want to end a conversation? And how you have to kind of engage in this process of reading the other person and guessing. And then, of course, there's the middle. What do you do in the middle? How do you change topics? And so you have to constantly kind of be trying to read the other person, and you need the conversation in order to read them better, but you also need to read them in order to have a functional conversation. And so it creates, this challenge in a lot of interesting ways. All right, and then the second big problem I like to think about, and Rafael Batista is a great PhD student at Chicago Booth who's kind of leading this work, is a translation problem. All right, and I'm just going to kind of spend a minute talking about this because I find this really interesting. If anyone has any thoughts, they can jump in. So I'll throw everything up just so we can look at it. So usually, if you just think about the two images in the middle here, there's the kind of speech bubble and there's the ear. And by the way, I'm just simplifying this into kind of speech. But this doesn't have to be in terms of speech, right? We can also think, of course, of anytime there's kind of a communicator and there is some audience on the other side. It could be via writing or anything else, or not nonverbal even. All right, and so a lot of research has been done on these kind of two middle images, the speech bubble and the ear, right? And not as much has been thought about in terms of that there's a translation issue that occurs from in the mind. And so you can think about the communicator having some thought that is not necessary, it doesn't necessarily show up in words, right? There's been some research that shows that some people think entirely in pictures. All right, and so then you have to translate it somehow from its amorphous thought into language of some form, which we'll call articulation. Think about it as like the kind of mind to mouth translation issue. All right, let's say that you're successfully able to do that, and people have a subjective sense of success or lack of success, which we can call misarticulation. And then there could be more sort of objective forms that you could look at as well. And they don't necessarily align, right? So I might think I did a terrible job expressing this idea to Jen, and she might think she might actually have gotten it somehow magically. And so maybe I didn't do such a terrible job. And then there's once I have expressed it, it's out in the world somehow, then it has to be heard. And so it has to be consumed in some way. And that's, almost mechanical, but also very important, right? Because it requires attention and so on. And so that you can think of as, the reception. So if it's out in the world, is it even received? Are you all actually even listening to me right now? And then there's another translation issue that kind of occurs on the other side here, which is that, you've heard the words themselves, and maybe some things that go along with the words, like paralinguistic cues in terms of the way I said the words. But how are you interpreting it? How do you translate that into a thought? What are your kind of takeaways there? And so, ultimately you want this kind of match from one mind to the other mind, but there's all this translation challenge kind of in between. And you can kind of simplify this, and the way it's been written about before is sort of thinking about the expression side and thinking about the consumption side. And then all of these problems, I'm not even going to go into like a lot of research in depth on the problems, I'm just kind of leaving them up. But all of them are exacerbated by there being perceived or actual difference between two people. Okay. Okay. Jerry, go ahead.
All right, thanks. Again, I definitely don't want to derail you because I can't wait for you to get to the data, but here I am slowing you down. So just to clarify, it seems like there's another link, which is your introduction to the talk, is it has to go from my mind to your mind or your mind to my mind, but then I have to generalize my perceptions I have about you to the perceptions that I hold about your whole group in order for that to combat political polarization on an affective level, right? So even if I have a conversation with a member of a person of the other group and I solve the individual to individual problem that you're outlining on this slide, that is the dyadic relationship is great between me and this person on the other side of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. How do we know that I'll generalize my attitudes toward everyone as opposed to what we know from like the false polarization literature, that I might just assume, well, that must just be my friend over there. That person is just a moderate member of the other side. But I still think the rest of the members of their side are really, really extreme, those ones that I haven't had a conversation with yet.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this little model I put up, I don't know if you can see my cursor. It's very much like a one-to-one kind of interaction, just to simplify it. And there have been some people already that are thinking about the way in which group dynamics start to change this. And if you imagine you even have 3 people talking, everything just gets so much more complicated. The group minds problem, it's been called. And I think that your point about how do people form some inference and then maybe generalize it to other groups or across different topics, across domains, you know, kind of more, I would kind of add more to this side here. You know, what happens after the sort of the immediate interpretation of what was said, and then there's all these other kind of beliefs that form kind of on the tail end of that. That's very interesting.
And I just want to clarify that I don't mean that to be a way that cuts the quality of your research. I actually still think that all the findings of your research are still fascinating on their own. Like, to me at least, that may not be true for others on the call, but to me, even if you've just solved the problem one-to-one and you've found a way that enhances the affective kind of closeness or mitigates the affective disconnect between one person and another, to me, you can declare victory already. Like, I don't think you need the link to the other side. But since you made the introduction of the talk about political polarization, that's the only reason I'm asking that group question.
Yeah, and the data that I will present in the package today does not really look at that question of the extent to which, you know, it's really about my attitudes and beliefs. Well, a little bit. I focus on the primary, like, dependent variable is focused on my opinions about my partner, my conversation partner,
exactly. Yeah.
But also my overall political attitudes about the topic that we were discussing, but less about my beliefs about the entire group as a whole. But I do have some other work in the context of a camp called Seeds of Peace, in which I look at Palestinian, Jewish, Israeli teenagers who attend this camp and the kind of contact experience that they go through and how that changes them. And what's kind of promising about a lot of that work is that a lot of times they come in with very strong preconceived notions about the other side of their conflict, very, very negative, very antagonistic. And then because they don't know many people personally from the other side, we do see a lot of generalization, which is like once they get to know one member from the other side of the group, they because they don't know anyone, they kind of start to generalize that to the other members of the group. So that's been kind of promising, and there seems to be high levels of generalization in that particular context. But yeah, I mean, keep that in your mind as we go through the data. because I'm not sure how it would play out, in this particular context.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. All right, so a successful conversation. I mean, well, first we have to define what we mean by successful. And this is part of the challenge, right? When two people disagree strongly, have a conversation, they may have different goals in their mind. But here we'll just focus on the metric of understanding, the whole idea of merging minds. And we'll say that a conversation is successful when some perception, at least, of understanding. Ideally, it's actual understanding. I'll have an experiment that finally looks at actual understanding, but at least I'm measuring the perception of understanding occurs. All right, and so what are the components of a conversation that could make it more or less successful? When we think of successful as understanding your conversation partner. And so there are different categories that you might bring that might come to mind for you. One might be the characteristics of the communicator and the listener, such as individual differences in their levels of receptiveness, like some of Julia Minson's great work. Another would be characteristics of the situation. So to what extent am I being distracted by noise around me, for instance? And then there's characteristics of the communication itself. All right, and so that's kind of the piece that I'm thinking about here. And what's been studied most commonly is the medium by which the communication occurs. Sometimes that's called the channel. All right, and so what's been kind of the dominant theory in the communication space is media richness theory, which has been around since the 1980s and has been deeply debated. It's been modified. I'm not doing a full review at all. I'm not giving kind of full credence to the literature here. I'm just kind of mentioning a few updates of it. And the theory is pretty simple, but once you start thinking about it, a lot of questions emerge. The idea is that some media are just richer than others, and so you can see this kind of image here, which this image was derived from one of the original papers, and those richer media are just kind of more effective. And so there's the definitional issues like what do they mean by effective, and then also what do they mean by richness. And so some of this work I think does start to address questions from the theory and update on the theory quite a bit. All right, so let's just kind of start with richness. So the way that they have defined richness is somewhat circular in the sense that it's defined based on understanding. So a medium is richer if there is more understanding that occurs in the medium. And if you're sort of a psychologist, that feels a little bit like it's sort of lacking because it's not really lower level. And so it's like, okay, but then what makes it, what's the mechanism by which understanding improves? And so there are three in particular that we look at in this work. And so the three are the paralinguistic cues. And to kind of break down what I mean by that term, so that's anything that is beyond the semantic content that is being expressed, the exact words that I'm using. So you have a lot of this in voice or visual, like in body language. So you think about the intonation of a person's voice and their volume and the pacing and even the silence. So some of Jared's great work on silence. Now you can have paralinguistics in writing as well, right? And so that might show up as emojis, or there's some fun work in marketing that's kind of trying to track all of the paralinguistics of writing, where people write things like sigh and they put it in asterisks and they put it in caps, and so people are inserting kind of paralinguistic information into text. So that can happen, but it's it doesn't come up as much as what you see in voice, for example. And then the second thing is back channeling. And the way that I define this is these are just kind of reactions that another person shows to someone's statements. And they could be verbal reactions like, wow, yes, no. You know, they could be paraverbal, so it all depends on the tone of the voice. They could be nonverbal, so some of you are nodding or you're shaking your heads, and so you're giving me nonverbal back channels. And a lot of research, and I'm sorry not to be citing all this research on the slide, but a lot of research has shown that these are critical for being able to communicate with one another effectively, and that I need that feedback as a communicator to be able to know where to go next. You know, if you're hating this and I'm not getting any signal from you as I'm talking, then I'm not going to be effective as a communicator. So these things are quite important. And then the third thing is just synchronicity, which is the critical kind of alignment in time that occurs. So when I am talking, let's say to Jared, he can sort of immediately interrupt me. He can ask clarification question, not that he would do that. And so we can have this this kind of dyadic interaction that is closely aligned in time. Now, text-based communication by its nature tends to be less synchronous than voice-based communication, but you can manipulate even within text-based communication. So email is, you know, much less synchronous than text messaging, for example. Okay, so all of these things can be kind of manipulated across the media. Another big question that comes out of media richness theory, just to kind of show you this theory again, is that it suggests that, you know, a richer medium, like a face-to-face interaction, the way that they're defining richness, which I don't think makes a lot of sense, is significantly better than telephone, which is significantly better than a written interaction. Okay, and so the question is, you know, is it really linear, and what are the spaces between those? So, you know, is face-to-face exactly better than a phone conversation, as is email worse than a phone conversation? You know, how do you think about kind of the spacing there? And a theory I'm using very loosely here, but we've thought about the role of the voice in particular, suggesting that that voice is a very well-adapted tool to convey mind to another person, and that facial expression is not really as well adapted nor as clear, which is not to say that doesn't matter. It's often largely redundant with voice too. So as long as you have voice, the facial information maybe doesn't provide as much insight into the person's mind. And we've done experiments where we have, for example, subtitled videos compared to just subtitles. And you don't have the person's voice, the communicator's voice, but you can watch them and you can see them, or you just read what they have to say. And impressions change not at all of the person if you have the subtitled video compared to the subtitle alone. But if you do have access to their voice, just an audio clip, impressions change quite a bit. And in general, people tend to think of the communicator as seeming more thoughtful and emotional on average if they have access to that person's voice compared to just the text. So, you know, this makes me think that perhaps in particular, some of the role of body language might be exaggerated, might not be perhaps as strong as the importance of being able to hear a person, having been in the spoken medium in particular. All right. And then there's the question of, you know, how does this end up applying to conflict resolution and polarization, affective polarization? And so we will look at all these different outcome variables like perceived understanding, actual understanding, liking, the perception of conflict, and attitude change in our work. All right. And so here's kind of the model, just throw it up for you, that we're thinking about in terms of conflict resolution here. And so you have the structure of the communication, which you can think of as the medium. And then you have these kind of key characteristics of the medium that we think are really critical for, you know, what's been called kind of richness, but really understanding the paralinguistic cues, the back channels, the synchronicity of the medium. And then that plays into the conversation dynamics, which are both on the part of the communicator and the part of the listener, the consumer, let's say. And then these influence the kind of social outcomes in terms of partner impressions and so on. Okay. All right. So now, Yes.
Juliana, can I ask a question?
Of course.
I can't press my blue button because as a co-host, I don't have a proper button. So a voice question. I certainly feel like, you know, since we've been in the Zoom world, I've spent a lot more time thinking about communication mediums. And I'm wondering, has anyone looked at this sort of longitudinally, just in the sense that, you know, humans have had access to faceless voices for like 100 years, right? Basically, you know, ever since we got phones and records. But it's been a much, much shorter period of time since that we've had voiceless faces, right? Or like voiceless video, which is sort of almost never. Is there something about interpreting emotions and mind from voice that's partly due to skill and habit because we've just done it a million times?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, because when you started asking that question, I immediately thought of a longer time span, which is that it's been argued in kind of evolutionary psychology literature that that voice is, you know, that's kind of the way in which communication, you know, kind of first developed and language first developed in a more intimate sense. Writing didn't come until later, kind of in the evolutionary process. So it is sort of a newer way of communicating in the kind of history of human language. And, you know, it's hard to know kind of what to conclude from that. But then, of course, there's also what's happening in, you know, the last, you know, 10, 15, 20 years in terms of how communication channels are changing and updating and platforms are changing. And I am talking to so many startups that are trying to just like fundamentally change all the ways in which we communicate. You can imagine platforms that are now being built that are multimodal, in which, you know, we might be talking, but where it's being transcribed as we're speaking and the words are showing up on the screen, and we have chat that we can use at the same time. And, you know, everything is, you know, you can decide how you want to engage at any given moment. You can turn on and off video, you can turn on and off voice, and so on. And you can kind of switch really fluidly, which is close to kind of what we have, but it's sort of a step further. And one thing that I've started thinking about here is, well, not only, you know, how is the technology changing kind of ways in which people communicate, and are people getting better? And we've looked at, you know, just kind of concretely address it. We've looked at generational differences. So younger people's preferences versus older people's preferences, and whether we see differences in the way that they use media. And, you know, there are huge differences, right? Like sometimes when I give this talk to audiences where there are some older people in it, they're like, wait, what do you mean like synchronous writing? Like, are people really synchronously writing to each other? And it's like, yeah, they're doing that all the time. Like there's data that shows that young people are writing to each other more than they're talking to each other over social media and so on. And so, you know, we don't really find consistent generational differences in the effects that I'm going to show you. So you can kind of we don't find interactions consistently across our experiments. We do find differences in terms of people's preferences, which are not data that I'm going to show you today. But it certainly seems to be the case that younger people have a much stronger preference to be in the written medium than in a spoken medium. So that's interesting, but we don't see many differences in kind of actual once you randomly assign them into the different media. But you know, there are many questions to kind of explore there, and to think about how people's familiarity with the different media on the different platforms changes, you know, the different outcomes, and also kind of the norms that develop, right? And so you could argue that in a lot of written platforms and social media, that the norms are still not super clear, and that creates kind of chaos in terms of people's willingness to engage in online bullying and so on. So that's another thing to kind of think about there. I'll stop there. All right, thanks. Okay, so now maybe I'll go into some data. I know I've kept you all waiting quite a long time for some data, which is fun. And so I'll kind of walk you through a roadmap. So, you know, a really basic first experiment, we randomly assign pairs who disagree with one another on controversial topics into different conditions, video chatting, speaking, and writing. And we look at outcomes like their perceived understanding and their impressions of one another and so on. And this can already kind of give us some insight into, is video chatting commensurately better than speaking, like the media richness theory would predict, as is speaking to writing, or is it really more about like presence versus absence of speech or voice, in which case you might expect to just see a null effect in terms of video chatting versus speaking on some of these outcomes. All right, so we look at that, and then any possible differences that we find could have some really like kind of boring explanations. So for example, people just speak a lot more quickly than they write. About 3 times as much content can be produced in the same amount of time, even typing with young people who are quite good at that. And so that could just clearly be an explanation for sort of a problematic compound, I'd say. And so we look at addressing that in another experiment. And then trying to get a sense of, what's the magnitude of the effect of medium on understanding. And so we do that in a couple of different ways. I'll talk through one of those. And then critically, thinking about the psychological mechanism, and they're these are theorized moderators that come from that model I just showed you. So imagine that you have speech, but then you strip away the paralinguistic cues, so you transcribe it, or you have writing and you add a paralinguistic cues, like you have another person speak it, and then you could keep the semantic content the same, and you could look at just the effect of the paralinguistic cues on different outcomes. So we do that in experiment 5. And then another experiment looks at the role of those back channels. And so there you can imagine we have like transcripts of conversations where we can clean out those little reactions. We put them in, or we keep them in, or we take them out. And then we can see how observers' perceptions of communication changes as a function of that. So we're trying to isolate sort of the causal impact of these kind of mechanisms. And then a 7th experiment here that looks at the role of synchronicity. And so you can do this where you have a spoken conversation, but you make it more or less synchronous. All right, so what does an asynchronous spoken conversation look like? That could be that I'm sending voice messages to Julia. Okay, so I send her a message, she listens to it, she sends a message back, I listen to it. It's a conversation, but it's a more asynchronous one than would occur if we were just naturally talking. And you can do something similar with writing, where we're writing back and forth, or I write a message, she reads it, she writes the message back, I read it, so on. So we can manipulate those things orthogonally. And then finally, trying to look at this kind of in the field, where all of these different organizations that I had put up on a slide earlier, a lot of them are doing kind of political conversation events. One that we've been partnering with is Bridge USA. And so we run a number of experiments with them in which we just go to their political conversation events, and surprise, we randomly assign people to communicate with one another in different ways, in different rooms. And we look at some kind of outcomes that relate to that. All right. Okay. So let's go through this. And I'm not going to show you all 10 experiments. We don't have time for that, but a lot of the paradigms are very similar. So I'll be able to kind of go through a couple of them pretty quickly. Okay, so this will kind of bring you into the paradigm that we use. So what we do is we will use a particular sample. So in this particular experiment, we use UC Berkeley students and sign up Berkeley. And we will conduct a pre-survey with, say, 200 people in that sample. And on that survey, we will ask about many different topics that we think that the sample might find controversial. All right, and this is all in pursuit of trying to select a point of disagreement in the sample. And so we ask people to report their opinions on these topics and how strongly they feel about them. And then we look for the topics where there's the most bimodal distributions of people that support and oppose, and that people feel the most strongly about it. And then we select some of those topics to use for the actual study. All right, so in this, first, when we have different topics across the different experiments, just to focus on generalizability, but in this particular experiment, we were looking at things like, they're talking about introducing a race quota for admissions at UC Berkeley, the use of GMOs in the cafeterias there. And then there was some discussion for some reason about changes to the drinking age that people found kind of fun to talk about. Okay, and then we run the main study in which we bring people into the lab. Later iterations of this were done on Zoom, but earlier iterations, pre-COVID, we were able to do it in person in the lab. And participants come in and they fill out a pre-survey reporting their own opinions about those particular topics. Then they complete a filler task, which was typically a 44-item personality survey, and we pair them based on strong disagreement. And then they have a conversation. So everyone here is forced to have a conversation. Now, many people would opt out if they could, but they're there, and so they're forced to do it. And then we randomize the way in which they have the conversation. And then they report about their experiences in a post-survey. All right, and so this experiment was run in a lab that was a computer lab. And so you have 2 to 20 people coming in at a time. And so the randomization occurs at the session level. If we ideally we'd be randomizing at the pair level, but it's too hard when there's 10 pairs in a room for each of them to be in different experimental conditions. They all kind of have to be in the same experimental condition. All right, and so here we have the 3 conditions. They're either video chatting with one another, they're speaking, or they're writing. And we keep the platform that they're on the same, just to keep that constant. And so they're on Skype here. Okay, so Skype has the capacity to do all those things. And so before they even have the conversation, when they complete this pre-survey, they're reporting their attitude balance, how much do they oppose or support the particular topic, and then how strongly they feel on a 0, 1, or 2 scale. And where 0 is like, I don't care, 1 is I care somewhat, and 2 is I feel strongly. And then we ensure that they are on different ends of the valence scale. So if one person is on the oppose end, the other person is on the support end. So they're at least 4 points apart on 1 to 7 scale, and they all are at a 2. So they all care about it. All right, so that's what we kind of consider strong disagreement on the particular topic. All right, and then during the conversation, we collect all the data because this is rich data. We record them with their consent, of course. And so these are actual participants from this experiment. So the video chat, they put on headphones, because they're in the lab together so they can communicate with one another. So they either see each other, they just have the audio, or they're writing to each other. And they have 10 minutes to communicate with one another. All right. And then after the conversation, they tell us about that experience. What were their impressions of their partner? So we ask questions that are related to thoughtfulness as well as to perceptions of warmth. I'll say the cognitive and the warmth dimensions. Understanding, how much did you understand your partner's opinions? That should have a parenthesis there. Conflict, perceptions of conflict, how much conflict was in the conversation. Changes in attitudes, so subjective changes. To what extent did you subjectively feel like you agreed with your partner? As well as we measure attitude change pre versus post. So somewhat of a more objective measure there. And I can just go right into the results for you. So on the y-axis, we have their report on the survey scale. All right, and these are not really deep areas of conflict because people are on the high end of the scale. Anyone who does person perception research knows that people often report on the high end of the scale. So it's a 1 to 7 scale, but I'm just kind of showing you the top half of it. And so the first thing that you see is that in aggregate, on average, there are no differences between video chatting versus just speaking with no video at all of their overall impressions of their partner. All right, now, when they're writing to each other, there is a difference. Okay, so there they see their partner less positive, less thoughtful, they like them less compared to the other 2 conditions. All right, so this is sort of immediate evidence where it's like, okay, we're not really seeing a linear effect here. It's really more about, are they speaking or are they not speaking? Are they writing? And then looking at perceptions of understanding, you see the exact same pattern there. And then perceptions of conflict, you see the same pattern flipped. So there's perceived more conflict in the writing condition compared to the video chatting and the speaking conditions. Charlie, go ahead.
This is super interesting. Thanks, Juliana. So you started the talk with data on kind of how much we hate the other side. And I'm curious in terms of like, how big of a drop in the bucket is this? In terms of like, how big of a levers are we pulling here? Like, is this something where like, we can get rid of half? Like, how many years do we get to turn back the clock on animosity with an intervention like this? Or should we think of this as kind of like one small nudge where like a lot more is needed beyond communication medium?
I would think of it more in the latter category. It's a small nudge. You know, these are, you know, it's a point on a 1 to 7 Likert scale. I so wish I had a better, in fact, I'm remembering the last time I presented this to an audience at Harvard, they were asking similar questions like, are there other kind of comparison metrics we can think about in terms of understanding the size of this effect? And I don't have like a great way to kind of quantify it. But, you know, my sense is that this would change, you know, one interaction that you have, and it would kind of change your overall impression of how that interaction went. And then I think other work should be done. This is not really my work, but other work could look at how does that aggregate? You know, I mean, even though it's kind of a drop in the bucket in a sense, we have all these interactions all the time, right? And so if you know, young people are reporting that they're having most of their interactions with the other side via text, which I should look up the statistic on that so I can share it with you, but that is the case. And if they were to switch all of those interactions to be in more of an auditory-based medium, you know, how would that end up aggregating over the course of years? And how does that change their inferences? And I don't have the answer to that question, unfortunately, but that's my sense to think of this as kind of a small nudge that, you know, does meaningfully change. And in terms of a psychological effect, the effect sizes are quite large. But in terms of thinking about how to aggregate that, yeah, I don't know the answer.
It would be really interesting if, not that you need another experiment since you showed us 10 on that slide, but if you—
That's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah,
50 experiments.
But if you mirrored questions in your studies to like using the same response scale as Gallup or Pew or any of these other resources that track over time, you could like look at the different, like the effect size and just pure points on the scale and map it to like decades of increasing animosity. It would be really interesting to think about.
I like that. Yeah, it'd be nice to have some kind of comparison points for how to think about the effect. That's a very good point. Okay, attitude change. So here, the way that this one was calculated, this is the difference score from pre to post, and anything above 0 means that they are reporting moving in the direction of their partner's opinion. And so, you know, kind of amazing that after 10 minutes, all of them on average, you know, do report, well, sorry, not all of them, but on average, people do report that they're moving in the direction of their partner's opinion in every condition here, even in the writing condition. But it's more so the case in the video chatting and speaking condition. We had a dichotomous question that we asked at the very end of the survey, which was simply, you know, did you feel by the end of the conversation like you agreed or disagreed with your conversation partner? And participants only in the writing condition did they report they disagree. And the other 2 conditions, they actually felt by the end, like on average, more of them were reporting that they felt like they agreed than they disagreed, even knowing exactly how they were kind of matched on this, which I think is quite interesting. It does bring to mind, you know, questions that could be concerning, like such as in the video chatting and speaking conditions, were they even talking about the conflict, or were they more likely to talk about other things, or were they lying about their opinions? So, you know, they're not actually being truthful. And so, you know, we looked through all of the speeches and the video chats, and we transcribed them, and we had RA's code, and they do seem to be consistently across the conditions talking about what they were told to talk about. So that at least wasn't a concern. And then in terms of actual understanding, I'll share some data on that in one of the later experiments. Okay, so then there's this confident of time. Let me just kind of show you right away. So when you look at the transcripts and the written conversations together, you immediately see this. This is an actual conversation that happened, and you're like, oh, wow, something that just stands out right away is that the spoken conversations are a lot longer than the written conversations. All right, and so that makes you just wonder if, maybe if people have more time in the written condition, they would catch up to the spoken condition. Maybe they just don't really have enough time to get into the conflict and resolve it, just because people are just slower when they write. And so if that's all it is, it's still interesting, but it's not really psychologically interesting per se. So we wanted to test this in a follow-up experiment right away. And so here we manipulated the medium, and we just took out video chatting here. We just had speaking versus writing. And then we manipulated the length of time of the conversation. So do they have 6 minutes or 12 minutes? And so we originally started with 10 minutes. So we just made it a little shorter, a little bit longer. And that manipulation is between pair. Here, they're having totally unstructured dialogues, and we have new conversation topics. Again, selected in the same process, looking for these kind of controversial topics, but just to increase generalizability here. And so we're asking the same survey items. So I'm just going to skip the kind of the method and jump right to the results here. And so what we see if we look at the results, so when they're having the short conversations, they are still reporting that they have more positive impressions of their partner when they speak to one another than when they write to one another. And you see exactly the same result when they're having long conversations, and there is no main effect of time and no interaction whatsoever. All right, so it does not seem like that time really made any difference here. So, having twice as long to communicate with one another doesn't really change kind of the overall outcomes in terms of impressions. All right, it also doesn't change the overall outcomes in terms of perceptions of understanding, which kind of makes you think that they're kind of forming their beliefs about it maybe pretty quickly. And then in terms of conflict, you see a somewhat different pattern where actually conflict starts to creep up a little bit in the long written conversation. So there is, we didn't pre-register that we would test for this, but if you were to just look at the contrast in the writing conditions between short and long for conflict, you actually see that if anything, things are kind of getting worse in the writing condition with the long conversations. So, to us, this kind of suggests that it's really not just about time. It's something more intrinsic about the medium. Okay. All right. And then thinking about how to quantify this effect and the magnitude of it. And this isn't unfortunately where I would have like a comparison point to Charlie's question, but part of what we were wondering was, how rapidly kind of does this occur? What's kind of the longitudinal trajectory? And part of that was because conversation, it's such a black box in the way that it's measured. So even though, we did record all the conversations, and so we can do natural language processing on them and think about that, we don't have kind of measures at every single point in the conversation. We only get measures at the end of the conversation, subjective measures of how it went. And so we would love to have more kind of insight into the kind of the whole trajectory of the conversation. So we did attempt to do this in an experiment where we took the longer spoken and written conversations from the experiment I just showed you, and we transcribe them. So now they're all in writing. And then we separate them into exchanges. And an exchange would be a substantive exchange of content. So I would say something about, my opinion to Charlie, and then he would say something back. And it could be a reaction, but if it's a reaction, it's sort of a longer reaction. And then when I move on to a different topic of, I share more content, that would kind of be the next exchange. All right. And then we gave all of those exchanges to a set of observers on MTurk, 460 observers on MTurk. And we told them that they're reviewing this conversation between students from UC Berkeley who took part in experiments. We gave them kind of the background of it, person A and person B. And then they read the conversation, and for each exchange, they make ratings. So they give us some insight into what was kind of happening at every exchange point. All right, so this is our attempt to kind of backwards look at kind of what happened in the conversations. It's limited because it's not from the perspective of those who were in the conversation, it's from the perspective of observers. But we collect the observers' ratings of how much agreement there was and how much understanding and liking and conflict and so on. All right, and then we can kind of chart the kind of trajectory And we pre-registered quantifying it, visualizing it in such a way that we have sort of the first exchange, that's the start of the conversation. We have the very last exchange, that's the end, and then we have the middle of the conversation. And so the agreement scale, all these are on 1 to 7 Likert scales. And so what you can see is in the very beginning, the spoken, the written conversations are seen to have similar levels of agreement. In fact, usually the first exchange, they're not really substantively getting into the conflict yet. So, they're kind of just above the midpoint of the scale. That's how they're being perceived. Okay, but no significant difference, of course. By the time you get to kind of the standardized first middle section of the conversation, observers are already telling a difference in terms of the levels of agreement. They are reporting that the spoken conversations are showing more agreement with one another than the written conversations. All right, and that seems, we believe that has a lot to do with those kind of reactions, the back channels, which you see in the spoken conversations. A lot of the reactions are like, I see what you're saying, and here's what I think. And you don't get that as much in the written conversations. Okay, and then you can kind of look at the rest of the trajectory, and it kind of goes up from there, and sort of the perceived level of agreement increases in the conversations, and you don't see different meaningful differences in kind of slope here. The trajectories look kind of similar. It's just sort of a main effect that kind of shows up right away.
Juliana,
Can
I ask a quick question?
Of course.
You guys ever taken the text, both the written text and the spoken text, and put it through something like, through any version of NLP, right? Because I mean, just the examples you're giving make it sound like there's a lot more conversational warmth in the, right? Like I can imagine just sort of like putting myself intuitively into that situation, right? Like you feel much more liberated to be cold and terse in text than you do in speech. I mean, this is a lot of what people talk about with like online bullying and stuff. Do you see, like, have you tried quantifying that?
Yeah.
And is that even true? Is that even right?
Yes, we have done some really basic kind of analyses. I actually have like a full database of 1,000 conversations if anyone would like to take a look at them. Charlie,
yes, please.
Please contact me because it's not really my area of expertise to do the kind of NLP. But we've kind of run them through Luke, really basic kind of word count. And what we find is that the transcribed spoken conversations compared to the written ones differ on almost every dimension that shows up in Luke. They're very different. Use of personal pronouns, the warmth, they have like authenticity indices, everything is really different, statistically different. And so it's kind of like, do we throw it all in a model and see what kind of mediates and what pops out? Or do we think about this kind of from the theory perspective? And there's different ways of, you could kind of try to look at it methodologically from a measurement approach and kind of throw everything into a model and see what pops out. And we've chosen to kind of pursue it more in terms of thinking about it theoretically. So I don't really have an answer for you in terms of, I don't know kind of what pops really, and hasn't been sort of consistent across the different experiments. But your intuition, I think, is right. Yes, that all of the content is quite different in the spoken than in the written conversations. And I think it would be fun to do kind of more analyses on that if I could find someone who has, expertise and would want to work with me.
We know some people.
Great. Okay, good. Well, we'll be in conversation about that. Okay, and so perceived understanding shows kind of a similar trajectory. Lots of other interesting things to think about here. Something that's just kind of funny is that the end of the conversation, sometimes you see the observer's perceptions aligning again between the written and the spoken. It seems that there's just some sort of norm in the written conversations where people kind of sign off in a very civil way. Like, it was lovely. They're very formal. It was lovely chatting with you, like Charlie, and I hope we have a chance to chat again. And so there's some little boost that you sometimes see in the written conversations. But okay, so we are running out of time. So I am going to mention a couple other things. I'm going to mention the synchronicity data, one of the theorized moderators, and I'll mention one little finding out of the field data, and then I'll wrap up. Okay, so in this experiment, we again manipulated the medium between pairs, and we manipulated synchronicity and asynchronicity in the way that I talked about before, asynchronous being that is divided in time. One person gets a chance to speak for 1 minute, randomly assigned to be person A or person B. The other one would listen for a minute, and so on. That would repeat for a couple rounds. Or if they're in the writing condition, they're reading or writing. And then synchronous conversations, they're just speaking or writing synchronously for 12 minutes. And we measure all the same things that we do in the other experiments. And the reason I wanted to show you this experiment in particular is that we find the strongest moderation when we manipulate synchronicity. In fact, it actually, and this was a little surprising to us, we did not pre-register this. So this result was not really hypothesized. It totally turns off the effect of the medium. So asynchronous speaking, they're no longer perceived, they don't perceive their partners more positively than in asynchronous writing, which really does signal that the synchronicity of the medium is very important. So that's something we're finding kind of over and over again. Synchronicity is really critical. And you see kind of similar patterns with understanding. It kind of the effect can almost entirely turn off when the pairs are in the asynchronous conditions. Okay. And then field data, we're working with this organization. As I mentioned, they host these political conversation events at campuses all across the country, and we've worked on some of the campuses. And we pick a controversial topic for the particular sample by which they have a variance and disagreement. And then we randomly assign pairs that enter into the conversation event. They're just showing up to kind of be part of the event to either speak or to write. And we have them do multiple conversations. So they're here for like an hour. So we can have them do many conversations, and we can give them pre-surveys and post-surveys after each of their conversations. And we also record the conversations using Ambit. And so one thing that I kind of like about this design is that it's a very conservative design, particularly in the writing condition, because so these are the speakers over at this table. And then these are the writers at the table in the forefront. And you can see they're writing to each other on their laptops, but they're there in front of each other. They can see each other over the laptops. They could even talk to each other if they wanted to. All right, but they're told to write to each other. And so they actually have like the visual information. And so we can see if the effect is still robust in this kind of really conservative test of it. And so we measure things afterwards, like their impressions of their partner and their perceptions of understanding. And then also we had them guess about their partner's opinion. So, to what extent do you think your partner opposes or supports this particular topic? And we can compare that to their partner's actual opinion to get a sense of the actual understanding. All right. And so, a couple interesting things to note here, because there's a range of agreement and disagreement, we can see if that actually moderates the effect of the medium. It really doesn't seem to. There's not much of an interaction that pops out. So even among people that are agreeing, you see that speaking is having more positive consequences than writing. And we replicate this kind of main effect of the medium very easily here. And what we see is that actual understanding is better in the speaking condition. So here, closer to 0 means they're more accurate at predicting their partner's opinion. So speaking people are more accurate than the people that were writing to one another. Okay. So now I know I'm a little over. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up, and I'm happy to stick around if anyone has questions or wants to talk more. So one, there's a lot of evidence now that I think we need to update media richness theory in a bunch of ways. We consistently find, null effects are hard to interpret, but we consistently do not find any evidence that video chatting is sort of richer than saying audio alone in these one-on-one conversations. Seems that the presence or absence of the speech is kind of the dividing line. The effect is robust in a bunch of ways. It didn't vary across different topics or different political ideologies of the participants, or even the level of disagreement. You still are seeing a consistent effect of the medium. It seems to happen, or the changes happen early in the conversation, and it changes both actual as well as subjective understanding. And in terms of what's kind of the mechanism, we really think that the paralinguistic cues and synchronicity, really in particular, is what's kind of driving the effect of the medium. Okay, so good news here. We find that, conversation can consistently reduce affective polarization. Even writing will reduce it in these experiments. The bad news is that, that's difficult to scale. People won't engage. A lot of the kind of studies going on right now, they won't even look at conversation because they're being done online and they're trying to scale, and you can't really have these conversations online, or you get a lot of attrition in some of those contexts. And I think, it's really important for us to be building better theories of the different social dynamics of conversation and thinking about, how do we overcome the coordination problem and the translation problem, and thinking about this more in the realm of conflict resolution. So I will stop there, and thank you all for your time. This was really fun, and I'm happy to stick around and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana. That was fabulous. Yeah, everyone can sort of log off if you've got stuff to do. But if you've got a few questions, then Juliana has graciously agreed to stick around and chat with us some more. I've been sitting here thinking about a question.
I'm going to stop my share so everyone will feel more comfortable.
Okay. So this is a discussion